Damian Cross calculated every kill like a chess move. Malik Rowe turned every murder into a message. On opposite sides of the country, these two men built criminal empires soaked in blood and fear, one silent and surgical, the other loud and merciless. But when their worlds collided in the heart of Chicago, the streets became a battlefield, and the nation came closer than ever to being ruled by shadows. This is the chilling true crime story of how two of America's most dangerous gang leaders nearly brought the system to its knees, and the shocking twists that sealed their fate. Los Angeles was no stranger to gangs, but in the summer of 2019, something different began to stir in the city's underbelly. Whispers of a new group were spreading like wildfire, even among the most hardened street crews. They called themselves the Crimson Vultures. At first, no one took the name seriously. It sounded theatrical, like something out of a bad movie. But within weeks, that name was spoken with fear, and for good reason. What set the Crimson Vultures apart wasn't just their violence, it was their discipline. This gang didn't tag walls or blast music from lowriders. They moved silently, like ghosts. Entire safe houses of rival gangs were wiped out in coordinated strikes that left no survivors, only a crimson feather placed carefully on each body. Drug routes were hijacked with surgical precision. Bank accounts belonging to small-time kingpins were emptied overnight. The city's criminal ecosystem was being rewritten, and no one knew who was behind it. The man pulling the strings was Damian Cross, a former U.S. Army intelligence officer who had vanished years earlier under suspicious circumstances. Once praised for his brilliance in psychological warfare and surveillance tactics, Damian had been dishonorably discharged after his unit was linked to civilian massacres overseas. While the military buried the scandal, Damian disappeared, until he resurfaced in Los Angeles with a new purpose. He didn't come alone. Damian handpicked his recruits from the margins of society: ex-military, disgraced law enforcement officers, rogue tech experts, and streetwise orphans with nothing to lose. He trained them relentlessly, instilling military discipline and absolute loyalty. They operated in cells, each isolated from the others, making infiltration nearly impossible. Weapons were smuggled through shell companies. Communications were encrypted with military-grade software. Their movements were mapped out like battlefield strategies. Damian's approach to domination was different. Rather than waging open war with existing gangs, he dismantled them from within. He sent operatives to join rival groups under false identities. Within weeks, those groups would implode, members turning on each other, shipments going missing, leaders found dead under mysterious circumstances. In some cases, entire crews simply vanished, erased from the city like they never existed. One of Damian's most trusted operatives was a woman named Juno Rivas. A former combat medic, dishonorably discharged for theft of classified supplies, she became Damian's second-in-command. She was quiet, observant, and deadly. Juno handled internal discipline and intelligence gathering. No one crossed her and lived to tell about it. She was also the one who began placing the crimson feathers, a symbolic gesture meant to unsettle, to unnerve, and to announce the vultures. Presence without a single word. The vultures quickly expanded their control. They moved into narcotics, arms dealing, cybercrime, and even human trafficking. But they did it smartly. No flash, no unnecessary bloodshed. Just a quiet takeover of markets and networks that had been ruled for decades by older, louder gangs. The police were confused. The crime statistics didn't spike the way they usually did during turf wars. Instead, old cases dried up. Known gang members disappeared. Officers didn't even realize a new gang was rising until it was already two. Late publicly, Damian Cross didn't exist. No record of his residence, no trace of his financials. Even the military denied any involvement with someone by that name. But within the criminal underground, Damian's legend grew. He was said to be a ghost, a man with eyes everywhere and motives no one could decipher. Some believed he was building a private army. Others thought he was planning a war against the government itself. But Damien wasn't driven by chaos or revenge. He was building something bigger, an empire rooted in silence and control. He believed the age of loud, reckless gangs was over. What he envisioned was a criminal organization so efficient, so hidden, that it could run parallel to society without ever being noticed. And it worked. For a time. By late 2020, the Crimson Vultures had become the most feared name in Los Angeles' Underworld. Politicians were being bribed, cops were turning blind eyes, and tech infrastructure was quietly being compromised. Yet no one had any concrete evidence. Every move Damien made was deliberate, layered, and hard to trace. The city had no idea how close it was to being ruled from the shadows. The Crimson Vultures weren't just another gang. They were a new kind of power, and the rest of the country hadn't even noticed them yet. But they would. Soon. Because Damien wasn't planning to stop in Los Angeles. It was only the beginning. While Los Angeles trembled under the silent shadow of the Crimson Vultures, a different kind of terror was gripping Baltimore. It was louder, messier, and far more brutal. The name echoing through the streets, there was Malik Rowe, better known by those who feared him as the Butcher. Unlike Damien Cross, Malik didn't hide in the shadows. He made a spectacle of violence and turned it into a message. And the message was always the same. Fear me, or die screaming. Malik had once been a high-ranking member of the East Harbor Kings, one of Baltimore's oldest and most notorious gangs. Known for their drug trade and brutal enforcement tactics, the Kings had ruled the city's eastern corridor for over a decade. But their grip began to loosen as new players emerged, and internal power struggles started to eat away at their structure. Malik, once a loyal enforcer, saw the cracks and decided to exploit them. The turning point came during a violent dispute over territory near Canton. 3 lieutenants were found beheaded, their bodies nailed to warehouse walls. Though no one claimed responsibility, the signature was clear. This wasn't a random hit. It was a calculated purge. A week later, Malik vanished, presumed dead in the gang war that followed. But the truth was far more disturbing. Malik had used the chaos to disappear and rebuild. He spent months off the radar, traveling across state lines and establishing a new kind of network. When he returned, it wasn't to rejoin the Kings. It was to destroy them. He re-emerged as the head of a new gang called the Night Serpents, a ruthless organization that believed fear was the purest form of power. The Serpents didn't just kill, they sent messages with their victims. Public hangings, ritualistic dismemberments, and bodies set on fire in public parks, each act carefully planned, each victim chosen for maximum impact. Baltimore's criminal landscape changed almost overnight. The East Harbor Kings tried to fight back, but were quickly overrun. Their safe houses burned, their leaders vanished. Those who survived either fled or joined the Night Serpents under threat of death. Within months, Malik Rowe had claimed the eastern and southern districts of the city with unmatched brutality. Unlike Damien Cross, Malik didn't employ subtlety. He wanted to be seen. He encouraged videos of executions to circulate in underground forums. He left notes pinned to corpses, taunting both rival gangs and law enforcement. His message was clear. The Serpents were not a gang. They were a movement. Despite his savagery, Malik was not without strategy. He knew how to manipulate people, when to offer power, and when to remove it permanently. His inner circle included cult-like loyalists, individuals who owed their lives to him and would kill or die on command. Among them was a woman named Ellis Carr, a former trauma nurse who handled the Serpent's medical needs and interrogations. She was as methodical as she was ruthless, and she helped Malik run the Serpents like a war machine. But Malik's ambitions extended beyond Baltimore. He began forging alliances with other gangs along the East Coast, offering them protection in exchange for loyalty. His influence spread to D.C., Richmond, and even touched parts of Philadelphia. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states flagged the Night Serpents as a growing threat, but no one had a clear way to stop them. The gang operated across state lines, used burner identities, and had moles embedded in city offices. Everything about Malik's rise seemed impossible, yet every week brought new evidence of his expanding control. What no one realized was that Malik was planning something bigger, something that required more than fear. He began making inquiries into encrypted communications, satellite tracking systems, and darknet black markets. Slowly, he was transforming the Night Serpents from a savage street gang into a high-functioning criminal syndicate. During this expansion, Malik learned about Damien Cross and the Crimson Vultures. At first, he was amused by their reputation. He saw them as precise but emotionless, less a gang and more a silent corporation. But the more he studied them, the more intrigued he became. Here was someone like him, ex-military, strategic, and unbound by traditional gang values. Yet where Malik embraced violence for attention, Damien used it to disappear. The two men were destined to collide, but their histories had already intertwined. Years before either gang had risen, both men had crossed paths during a covert training, Operation Abroad. They had been part of a classified military project that blurred the lines between soldier and weapon. The project was eventually dismantled, but the tension between Damien and Malik had already turned personal. They had loathed each other for their opposing ideologies, and now they were building empires on opposite coasts, one in silence, the other in screams. It was only a matter of time before their paths crossed again, and when it happened, it would not be a negotiation. It would be war. Chicago had always been a city of contradictions, beautiful and brutal, progressive yet plagued by deep-rooted corruption. It had seen its fair share of gang activity over the decades, but by late 2022, the city was beginning to experience something far more insidious. A wave of seemingly disconnected events started to unfold. Armored car heists executed with military-level precision, cyber attacks that shut down portions of the city's surveillance network, and high-ranking members of local gangs vanishing without a trace. The police were baffled. No one claimed responsibility. No one left a trail. But it was no coincidence. Chicago had become the staging ground for something unprecedented. Behind the scenes, two of America's most dangerous figures had arrived in the city. Damien Cross of the Crimson Vultures and Malik Rowe of the Night Serpents, enemies in philosophy, but united by a temporary, fragile ambition. They had agreed to something few believed possible: a merger. Operating under the code name Project Suture, the plan was to build a hybrid super gang that would span both coasts, linking their power bases through the heart of America. The goal wasn't domination through force alone, it was control of networks, resources, information, and fear. Chicago, with its deep infrastructure, strategic location, and fragmented criminal landscape, was the perfect testing ground. While the city's police were occupied with gang wars, Damien and Malik moved in silence. Their top operatives began taking over local outfits, either by bribing their leaders or quietly eliminating them. They didn't need turf, they needed influence. Nightclubs, trucking companies, tech startups, and even charities, any organization with value or reach was quietly absorbed. But the alliance was uneasy from the start. Damien's calculated approach clashed with Malik's volatile style. Where Damien preferred to remain unseen, Malik thrived in spectacle. Their meetings were tense, held in abandoned industrial sites, under layers of surveillance and security. At one such meeting, Malik proposed a show of force to let Chicago's gangs know who was really in charge. Damien rejected the idea, arguing that power should be felt, not flaunted. Neither man trusted the other, but both knew that betrayal would mean destruction. Juno Rivas, Damien's second-in-command, watched the situation unfold with growing concern. She had stood beside Damien through the rise of the Crimson Vultures, but Project Suture felt different. She saw how Malik's influence began seeping into their ranks, how Damien, always composed, had started making decisions that seemed reactive, even paranoid. The trust that had once defined their inner circle was beginning to erode. Juno began collecting information, quietly, cautiously. She intercepted communications between the serpents and vultures, tracked financial transactions, and logged movements. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Malik was not only building his own network within the merger, he was planning for its collapse. His men were stockpiling weapons, securing escape routes, and reaching out to rival gangs under secret terms. It was a matter of time before he struck. Unsure whether Damien was aware or complicit, Juno took a risk. She made contact with a federal informant she had helped years earlier and arranged a data drop. Inside it were names, locations, code words, and a full map of the hybrid gang's structure. That file landed in the hands of the FBI's Organized Crime Division, and it set off a quiet panic within the agency. For the first time, they had proof of a coordinated multi-city criminal operation unlike anything seen before. But before authorities could act, Juno vanished. She was last seen entering a meeting in Bridgeport and never came out. Weeks later, her body was discovered in a refrigerated shipping container outside Detroit. She had been executed, one bullet to the head, her wrists bound behind her back. Lying beside her, soaked in blood, was a crimson feather. Her death detonated what was left of the fragile alliance. Damien believed Malik had ordered the execution. Malik in turn accused Damien of planting Juno as a double agent to dismantle the Night Serpents from within. Their partnership unraveled in a matter of days. Communication ceased. Units loyal to each leader began clashing in the streets. Gunfire returned to the neighborhoods of South and West Chicago. Only this time, it wasn't rival gangs fighting for territory. It was an implosion of something far more dangerous. What began as a covert experiment had erupted into an open conflict. The police had no choice but to respond. Federal agencies were brought in. Surveillance drones, SWAT teams, and encrypted intel feeds all zeroed in on the chaos unfolding in real time. Chicago had become a battleground for two criminal masterminds, each convinced the other had betrayed him. The city had reached its breaking point, and for the first time in years, the chaos wasn't born from the streets. It was carefully imported, cultivated, and unleashed by men who had always planned to walk away when the fire started. But as bodies began to fall and loyalties were tested, it became clear that neither Damien nor Malik had accounted for one thing. What happens when the war spills out of their control? The city of Chicago was on fire, figuratively and, in some cases, literally. In the final days of the Crimson Vultures and Night Serpents alliance, a new wave of violence erupted across neighborhoods, leaving residents terrified and authorities overwhelmed. Buildings were torched, highways blockaded, and entire city blocks transformed into war zones. What began as a silent takeover had evolved into an all-out war between two giants who once believed they could rule the underworld together. The federal government launched Operation Iron Net, a massive crackdown involving the FBI, DEA, ATF, and local law enforcement. Intelligence teams pored over surveillance footage, decrypted months of gang communication, and tracked supply chains feeding weapons into the city. Arrests began swiftly, targeting lieutenants, suppliers, and enforcers. But the two most dangerous men, Damien Cross and Malik Rowe, remained elusive. Damien had gone dark. After Juno's execution, his trust in anyone outside his original core crumbled. He relocated to a fortified safe house on the outskirts of the city and operated through a new protocol. No phones, no messages, no meetings. Those who needed to contact him were required to go through a layered chain of vetted intermediaries. His core belief had returned. Power only worked if it stayed invisible. Yet despite the efforts to tighten control, his organization was bleeding from within. Malik, on the other hand, leaned into the chaos. He emerged more aggressive than ever, launching retaliatory strikes against Crimson Vulture's safe houses and suspected informants. His methods became even more theatrical. One night, a luxury apartment complex known to house high-ranking Vulture members was blown up, killing 12. A note was left on the front gate. "No ghosts in my city." It bore, Malik's signature black serpent insignia. Law enforcement raced to prevent a full-scale collapse of civil order. Investigators began to suspect that the war was not just about betrayal, it was about legacy. Both Damien and Malik had realized that only one of them would leave Chicago alive. The city had become their final arena, and they were pulling out, all stops to cement their name in criminal history. Unknown to both men, their downfall had already begun from within. An ex-serpent named Cairo Flint, once Malik's logistics coordinator, had secretly flipped. He had been feeding intel to a shadow unit within the FBI after a narrow escape from one of Malik's purge campaigns. Cairo had access to weapons caches, shipping manifests, financial ledgers, everything the government needed to cut off the gang's bloodlines. He also knew something no one else did. Damien and Malik were both planning exit strategies, and both involved mass destruction. Cairo revealed that Damien had set up a remote explosives grid beneath a critical Chicago rail hub that ran weapons through 5 states. If triggered, the explosion would cause catastrophic economic damage and collapse regional supply chains, effectively erasing any evidence of the Vulture's presence while masking Damien's escape. Meanwhile, Malik had built a chemical bomb, hidden in an abandoned warehouse, meant to be detonated in a crowded district. His aim was not just to escape, but to leave a scar the city would never forget. Authorities were left with a terrifying dilemma. They couldn't arrest both men simultaneously without risking one triggering their doomsday plan. The operation to stop them had to be surgical, timed to perfection. A joint strike team was formed, codenamed Grey Dagger, and in the early hours of a cold January morning, they moved in. Damien was captured in a silent raid, sedated before he could react. His safe house was filled with encrypted documents, military blueprints, and evidence of a backup identity that would have allowed him to vanish into Eastern Europe. The explosives under the rail hub were disarmed just minutes before they were scheduled to activate. Malik, however, didn't go quietly. As agents stormed the warehouse housing his weapon, he engaged in a firefight that lasted 23 minutes. He was eventually killed, shot in the chest while trying to detonate the device himself. The chemical bomb was disabled by a hazmat team minutes later. With both leaders neutralized, what remained of their gangs fragmented. Some fled, others were arrested. A few attempted to reclaim power but were quickly swallowed by rival factions or disappeared without a trace. In the months that followed, Chicago slowly began to heal, but the scars left behind were deep. Entire neighborhoods were changed forever. Trust in local institutions had been shaken. Families had been torn apart by the violence, many of them, never knowing who or what started it all. Yet for all the damage they caused, Damien Cross and Malik Rowe were not immortalized in the way they may have hoped. Their legacies were sealed not in power, but in collapse. The truth revealed by investigators stunned the public, not just because of the scale, but because of how close the nation had come to falling under the shadow of men who never wanted to rule from a throne, but from behind a curtain. Inside America's most dangerous gangs were not just criminals. They were architects of fear, driven by control, obsession, and ego. And though they were gone, the systems they created still lurked in the dark, waiting perhaps for someone else to finish what they started.